Way back, in the waning days of October, I saw an article shared on my Facebook newsfeed with an odd headline. It was compelling to me. The headline read, "Queen offers to restore British rule over United States." Instantly, upon finishing the first two sentences of the article, I realized that this was a piece of satire, completely false. It was written for the humor section of The New Yorker. And the article was commenting on the sorry state of affairs that American social discourse found itself in the last days of the campaigns. It read as follows. In an unexpected televised address on Saturday, Queen Elizabeth II offered to restore British rule over the United States. Addressing the American people from her office in Buckingham Palace, the Queen said that she was making the offer, quote, in recognition of the desperate situation you now find yourself in. This 240-year experiment in self-rule began with the best of intentions, but I think we can all agree that it didn't end well. She said. The Queen urged Americans to write in her name on Election Day, after which the transition to British rule could begin, quote, with a minimum of bother. When I was looking at the Parsha for this week, I was reminded almost instantly of this headline, not so much because of the Torah text itself, but rather because of one of my favorite midrashim, which comments on the story. In this week's Parsha, Vayetze, we find the story, which we'll be reading from the Torah tonight, of Jacob and the ladder to heaven. I put ladder in quotes because we don't actually know what the ladder is. The word in Hebrew for ladder, which is used in the Torah, sulam, is what is called by biblicists a hapax legomenon, which is the Latin term for a word which appears only one time in the entire Bible. The trouble with words like that is that unless we have a specific origin or etymology for where they come from, all we can discern about their meaning comes from the context in the story, and the context in this case is angels are going up and down on it, so ladder works as an image. The midrash that made me think of that article comes from a collection called Midrash Tanhuma, which was edited during the beginning of the 5th century, around the midpoint of the creation of the Talmud. And in the midrash, Jacob sees not only the angels of God going up and down the ladder, but also the angels of the 4 kingdoms of the day. The story goes that the angel of Media, which just means Persia, went up 52 rungs and then came back down, and the angel of Babylon went up 70 rungs and came back down. The angel of Greece, 180 rungs, and of course came back down, and the angel of Edom, which is just rabbinic doublespeak for Rome, went up all the way so high that Jacob couldn't see it anymore. So Jacob gets worried that the angel of Rome is never going to come down. Like, is Rome God's new chosen people? But God says to him, "Don't worry, my servant, for even if Rome rose as high as an eagle and made its nest just beside me, I would still bring them down from there." I think it's important to note here, all 4 of these nations, these kingdoms, were nations that oppressed the Jews, and all of them were brought down. That's the first version of the story. That first version is what made me think of this article, of the Queen referring to our country as a 240-year experiment. It isn't terribly likely that any of us in this room, even in the aftermath of an election year, which stirred up perhaps some of the most divisive language that we've ever heard, it's not likely that many of us believe that the country itself is on the verge of collapse. That said, it's likely not. But put yourselves in the shoes of these rabbis that were writing in the beginnings of the 5th century, around the 400s AD. Rome didn't officially cease to exist until 476. And in the year 400, despite Rome's political strife, it's inconceivable that someone could have predicted the fall of the most powerful empire ever to exist within 75 years. And yet, it did fall, as the Midrash predicts. It may very well be that the United States is not on the verge of collapse. We very well might be just in the middle of our climb up Jacob's ladder to heaven as a nation, but just because we're prosperous doesn't mean that we're unassailable or impervious to failure or to falling. As is the case in any climb, the middle of the climb, when the novelty of ascending disappears and we can't yet see the summit, is the hardest part. For better or for worse, and likely for worse. This election made exceedingly apparent the many, many social divides in our country. And we need to start repairing those wounds and opening up channels of communication to ensure that this diverse and entrepreneurial nation continues that climb. But like I said, that's only Midrash part 1. Part 2 tells the story in a totally different and perhaps a more visceral way. Jacob sees the angels of those 4 nations on the ladder. He sees Babylon go up and descend. He sees Persia, Media go up and descend. He sees Greece go up and descend. And he sees Rome go up and come back down. God looks to Jacob and says, Jacob, why don't you get on the ladder? It's your turn. You're my chosen people. Why don't you climb? And at that moment, Jacob looked up at God and said, because there is for all the nations who climb a descent. So therefore I would descend as well. And God replies, Imata ole ein lecha yerida. If you climb, you won't descend. But here's the kicker. Jacob didn't believe God. And Jacob didn't get on the ladder. This version of the Midrash makes me think about yet another young nation which is plagued by such ideological discord and vicious argument, disagreement, even hatred amongst its politicians and its very diverse populace as well. I speak, of course, about our other national home, Israel. Jacob, the protagonist of the story, later on receives another name, Yisrael, and it's this name which later becomes the name for our people. And Jacob's unwillingness to believe God in this midrash is befitting of that name, Yisrael, which means the one who struggles with or wrestles with God. This description is also very befitting of the modern Jewish people, which is in a constant struggle with God. I think it's important to note that the connection between America and Israel here, it's undeniable. Both of these nations value representative democracy. I would argue that democratic values like the ones championed by the United States and Israel are indeed Jewish values, intrinsically. And so in this way, we are Jewishly linked, not only to Israel, which is situated in the homeland of our people, of course, but we're also linked Jewishly to the United States through these shared values. The ladder in the Midrash is not only one which religious communities or faith communities are climbing, it's one which nations are climbing. So it would seem that it was not until the end of the 19th century, with the birth of Zionism, that Yisrael was ready to begin their climb of the ladder, which all great nations set out to climb. I don't know if Theodor Herzl and the other early Zionist thinkers knew about this midrash. If they did, and they believed it, it would seem that this midrash is sort of like a rubber stamp of approval for Zionism. God says if we start climbing, we won't fall. Okay, time to climb. But my guess as to what their actual response to the midrash is might be a little bit less naive about what they saw the Zionist vision as. The early Zionists had no illusions that the Jewish state was a pipe dream. The Jews were spread all over the world and never before had been able to rally behind one voice. And they didn't own the land which they were trying to possess and make into a nation. And they had to go through the powers that be, aka the English government, to get approval. And they had to find the money to do it. And. If Theodor Herzl and his early Zionist counterparts had read this midrash, I believe that rather than saying, we believe we won't come back down the ladder, they would have responded in the following way. We might fall. This might not work. But it's become an imperative that we try to climb. Because if we remain on the ground, to not even begin that ascent, it would be an abdication of responsibility. It would be to abandon the Jewish future, which we realize now is totally unsustainable in Europe's circumstances. Even if we don't believe what God is telling us, it would be better to climb up to the heavens and try to stay up there as long as possible before our eventual climb down, than to never have taken our first step onto that first rung of the ladder. Both nations to which we subscribe our support, America and Israel, are in the midst of their climb. Both have encountered various, and in some cases very similar, challenges along the way up. Like the Sulam, our Habax Legomenon, the modern Jewish experience is perhaps a singular one in this world, an experience in which we have our feet in two different nations' climbs of the ladder simultaneously. Perhaps both ascents will reach all the way to heaven. But if not, are we prepared to do the tricky dance of trying to descend on one side while still climbing up the other? Might we be pulled apart by that choice? Only time will tell. Sorry, no answers. But for now, we can rest assured that it was only satire, and that the Queen's army of redcoats will not be knocking on our doors anytime soon. We now come to the Torah